welcome very much to you both.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much.
Farrah, I want to start with you. Can you just tell us exactly what happened this week?
I guess history was made yet again. America's obviously survived 234 years without a president or former president ever being indicted, and then along came Donald Trump. And this week, he was indicted for the third time in 4 months, this time for his role in trying to overturn the 2020 election, which, as we all know, culminated in that unprecedented and deadly attack on the US Capitol building on January 6, 2021. Keep in mind, it was only April that Trump became the first ever former president to get indicted, and that took place in New York.
That's a separate indictment.
Yes, it was a separate indictment over hush money payments to porn star Stormy Daniels over an affair they'd had many years ago. And I remember being in that court in downtown Manhattan at the time and thinking, man, this is truly incredible. And then in June, he was indicted yet again over his mishandling of classified documents that he took when he left the White House. And now he's going to be appearing in a DC court very shortly to be arraigned over a coordinated plan to keep himself in power after losing to Joe Biden at the last presidential election. It's truly wild.
And there is also a separate investigation in Georgia, isn't there, related to some electoral fraud there, that no charges have been brought yet?
No charges have been brought yet, and that also relates to electoral interference in that state of Georgia. The district attorney there from Fulton County is basically on the verge of announcing what could potentially be a fourth indictment for Donald Trump.
Farrah, the Justice Department appointed Special Prosecutor Jack Smith to investigate these federal matters, and he's brought the charges in the 2 federal indictments. What do we know about Jack Smith? What's his background?
So he's basically a former war crimes prosecutor who was brought in last November by Attorney General Merrick Garland to take over 2 Justice Department investigations involving Trump. The first one was obviously the classified documents case, in which Trump took sensitive material from the White House. And the second one was obviously this particular case involving the January 6th overturning election attempts. The reason he was brought in was because Trump announced he'd been running for re-election. And Garland, who is a Biden appointment, wanted to place some distance between him and the investigation. From what I know, he's a dogged, determined sort of prosecutor. He's not afraid to sort of pursue the truth. And I guess you'd have to be, given not a day goes by when he's not being attacked by Trump and his supporters. He made the way up the legal system through New York back in the 90s. I understand he was involved in a few sort of high-profile police brutality cases and some murder cases. But his real claim to fame, I suppose, was as a war crimes prosecutor in The Hague. One of his big cases involved securing the conviction of a former Kosovo Liberation Army commander who ran a prison where torture took place during the independence conflict with Serbia. But he's now, of course, going to go down in history as the bloke who charged Donald Trump twice, firstly for the classified documents case and now for this.
Peter, what do we know about Trump's reaction to the charges and what that reaction might tell us about how he will fight them?
Well, so far from the words of his attorney, it looks like he's going to be falling heavily on a freedom of political speech defence, which suggests that a president or any US citizen is free to say anything they want, whether it bears any resemblance to the truth or not, whether it signals intention to break the law or not, as long as that law isn't actually broken, and that the Trump people will try to defend it on the basis that saying these things, whatever he might have said, whatever's in the indictment, to Pence or his staff or to state officials, doesn't matter. It's simply free speech, which of course is not a reliable doctrine. There are many cases, and his attorney has made the case that there is no way of policing speech. There are no limits to freedom of speech. But we know that that's nonsense. There are all sorts of constraints on speech, incitement to violence, using speech to commit fraud, for example. So far, it's early days. So far, we'll see what else they can come up with. But it seems fairly flimsy, but we certainly know this. They're not going to give up and they're not going to walk away.
Mm. I want to talk now about how this interacts with his with Trump's run at the presidential nomination and then the presidency next year, which looks pretty secure. He's being spoken about as the front runner for the Republican nomination for the next US election, which of course is November 2024. And to any sort of, in any sane world, this would seem like an incredible and insane proposition given how much legal baggage Trump is carrying at the moment. But the normal rules don't really apply to Trump, do they, Peter?
Well, the key word you used there was sane. Sanity is not a qualification that Donald Trump has ever met. And in fact, I suspect it's one of the key reasons for his enduring popularity. In essence, Trump was elected because this is a country that had where enough of the citizens had given up on concepts of sanity, on the principles of the rule of law, and the fairness of the system overall. Sanity doesn't apply to Trump, and America, I think the preconditions were laid well before Trump. To me, a threshold moment was the 2012 election campaign. When Obama was running, his campaign manager, Jim Messina, came to him and said, listen, Barack, you've got to stop talking about the American dream. No one believes in it anymore. That was 2012. It was a country that's essentially given up and was ready for a post-sanity president. So you're right. None of the laws of sanity or the principles of a modern nation state obtain to Donald Trump. It's why he's so destructive. It's also one of the reasons for his enduring popularity, and he's not going to be bound by the rules of sanity now, that's for sure. If anything, he gets more deranged with each passing month, year, and each passing indictment.
I guess it's also worth looking at the modern Republican Party as to why he's, often spoken of it as indeed is the front runner for the Republican nomination for the US election next year. Conservative pollster Whit Ayres often explains that the GOP today is essentially made up of these three broad groups. So about 10% could be described as sort of the Never Trump faction, and they comprise people who still consider themselves Republicans but never supported Trump, didn't vote for him and aren't going to. Up to 60% could probably be viewed as the maybe Trump group who have voted for him previously but aren't entirely convinced they want him to run again. But there's this remaining sort of, 30% who make up this so-called always Trump faction. And they're the hardcore supporters who, as Whit often says, would walk through a wall of flame for Donald Trump. And he's got, in a sense, this really hardcore base of supporters. And that's making it really difficult for a lot of his rivals, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, US Senator Tim Scott, Nikki Haley, former Vice President Mike Pence, to penetrate. And the other thing I guess that's worth noting is that 3 in 10 Americans, roughly, still believe that Joe Biden won his election only due to voter fraud. That's according to the latest Monmouth University poll I saw, and that figure has virtually not changed since the 2020 election. And I've gone to towns and cities and spoken to some of those very people who genuinely believe that machines were spitting out votes for Biden when they were meant to go for Trump, or that thousands of dead people were casting ballots. So there is this kind of really hardcore group, and there's this mindset in America that makes Trump a very, very appealing candidate and gives him an advantage in the Republican race.
So, yeah, that's a full third of the population that basically thinks the system is so corrupted that an election could be ripped off. I just want to ask, though, about the legal troubles and how they do interact with his appeal to voters. Obviously, you're talking about, that rusted-on support base, which is presumably just going to, react to this latest indictment as they have to all of the troubles and slings and arrows that Trump's faced before, and just it'll harden their support for him. But what about a sort of more soft or middle percentage of voters who, might be a little bit turned off by all the drama, might think he's too much of a liability? I mean, is this going to sort of hurt him with possible swing voters?
Well, you'd have to hope so. I mean, the first 2 indictments failed to make any impression on his support base and only served as rallying points for him, his supporters and his fundraisers, and completely backfired if they were intended, or at least if the Democrats had hoped they'd put shackles on his campaign, they were bitterly disappointed. Those indictments were relative trivia compared to this. The core of this, it's broadly painted as being the January 6 insurrection or riot or whatever you want to call it. But the core of this is not just conspiring to obstruct, but obstruction. of an election and obstruction of the peaceful transfer of power. At the core of this is whether America remains a democracy. That's the core, and everything else sort of burns away into insignificance. So you would have to hope that enough Americans can see that that this third indictment, or this third set of indictments, would finally persuade some Americans that Trump has to be abandoned. And yet there is nothing since Trump first stood for the job that suggests that will actually happen. That would be a triumph of faith over experience.
Talk to us about the timing of these matters, Farrah. The presidential election is in November next year. Is it possible that Trump would be behind bars for the next election? Or is it possible that he might sort of be somewhere in the appeals process, win the election, and then be sworn in as president, because it doesn't matter if you've been convicted of a federal crime, you can still be elected president, isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question that often comes up. Do these charges mean that Trump can't run for president? If he's convicted, can he be blocked from holding office? The answer essentially is no. The US Constitution doesn't bar people convicted of a crime from running for president unless they've violated the 14th Amendment. And that provision basically says that someone can't hold office if they've taken an oath to the US, as Trump did when he was inaugurated, and engage in insurrection or rebellion against the country. So you can bet there's likely to be a bit of, civil lawsuit action in state courts trying to disqualify him on that basis. But the thing that I find interesting about this particular indictment is that Jack Smith sort of stopped short of saying Trump incited the insurrection on January 6th. If anything, the Capitol riots were like his closing chapter in these set of charges. The charges against Trump are far more focused on what he and his co-conspirators were doing in the lead up to January 6th, rather than the violence and the death that took place itself. So that's going to be an interesting sort of sticking point in the trial. And in terms of the trial date, we don't know when the latest trial will take place. What we do know is that they will basically add to a really hectic court schedule that Trump is already facing. At last count, I think he's got about 6 or 7 cases on his calendar so far. That would be the New York trial over hush money payments. That's meant to start in March 2024. There's the classified documents trial. That was meant to begin in May next year, but it's likely to be delayed because Jack Smith issued him with a whole set of new charges last week, some of which include, trying to erase surveillance footage at Mar-a-Lago to stop his investigation. There's another trial against writer E.G. Carroll, who Trump was recently found liable of sexually abusing back in the 90s. Then you've got the potential 4th indictment coming up over the alleged scheme to overturn the election results in Georgia. Who knows when that's going to come up? And then you've got a few others relating to Trump's business. So, he can't be on the campaign stump and in a court at the same time. So I guess they're going to have to manage that. And his plan, of course, is going to be delay, and then get into office and pardon himself if he manages to get into office. Or if he doesn't get into office, hope that one of the other Republican candidates will do it for him. And some of them have already indicated that they will.
Which, again, you'd imagine would be a catastrophe for American democracy. Peter, the era of Trump's presidency really marked an existential shift in American democracy. Trump oversaw a deepening partisan divide, weakened social trust, corruption of the values of public office as they were once defined. Is this trial likely to settle any of those, or will it just sort of deepen those problems?
I think Trump is a symptom, not a cause, of most of those problems, and he deepened pre-existing the pre-existing sort of neuralgia in US society. The departure of the Republican Party, even before Trump, from long-standing principles and practices of democracy, the abandonment of any commitment to, for example, long before Trump, the US Congress had been unable to pass a normal budget. That's a long-forgotten ability in American politics. Any thought about broader practices such as equality in US society had just been thrown out the window. These and the polarization was just extreme. So Trump has inherited all of those problems. I think the reason he won was because those problems were so deep they had already disenchanted so many Americans who are prepared to embrace somebody who is prepared to wreck the joint rather than even bother to try to repair it. and in that sense they were richly rewarded. So in what's happened since, really the only two chances that America has had, Joe Biden was, as some commentator put it, the calm between two storms, possibly. The only chance the country had was that A, Joe Biden and the Democrats would be able to change the objective circumstances of American life sufficiently that they could restore enough confidence and enough positivity in the American public that they would abandon the sort of sense of hopelessness and despair that makes Trump an appealing candidate. Or the second option was that Trump discredit himself or lose his underlying appeal to a lot of Republican voters. Neither of those has happened. So therefore, those existing problems simply continue, and we don't see any resolution here to the long-run decline in American commitment to the principles of democracy. And so the underlying conditions haven't improved sufficiently. The glaring, in fact, shocking inequality of America today has not improved in any sort of discernible way for most Americans. And even though they've got full employment, there's just not enough evidence in most people's lives that the situation has changed. And of course, Trump almost inexplicably retains the appeal that we've already been talking about.
And Farrah, just finally, Trump has, a way of eluding consequences of any kind. He's been accused of numerous shady business dealings, but he's still rich. He's been credibly accused of sexual assault by multiple women. He's never been charged. He was accused even of corruption in office, but he escaped impeachment. And impunity is very much part of his brand. But do you think that this indictment is the one that's finally going to stick, or will he be able to wriggle his way out of this one too?
Look, it's hard to say. It's obviously going through the indictment. It's a very detailed indictment. It really presents a case about a very coordinated and months-long plan to try to overturn the election results. Obviously, Trump was at the centre of it, but there were multiple co-conspirators, whether it be former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani or former Justice Department officials and other lawyers. But I guess there was a likelihood of prosecution, a good likelihood of prosecution in this particular case, and the seriousness and the gravity is obviously there. But I think it's potentially going to come down to timing. I mean, as I said, Donald Trump is going to continue to delay all of the charges against him and push them out as far as he could possibly go so that they are not tried before the 2024 presidential election. If they are, he'll pardon himself, and if they aren't, he'll hope that they just, become sort of smaller and less politically charged matters. So they're serious, but, the guy's Teflon, whether they stick or not is something I guess we'll see in due course.
It's terrifying and yet also fascinating. So I'm sure that we'll have you both back on to discuss the implications and the consequences of this indictment and all the other legal matters. So thank you both very, very much for being with us today. I appreciate it greatly.
Thanks, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much.